All right, guys, we have made it to the end. I'm going to call this the end because I'm not sure I'm finding enough concrete answers, which is part of today's final installment here. I want to talk about some of the things we've been able to answer. And a certain meta-analysis that I covered today does readily admit that there are a lot of things, the way this has been studied, that still leaves a lot open to future discovery. And so let me do one more little thing here. I'm not finding what I need. All right. Okay. So I said we're going to turn towards sugar. Some of the things we've covered, just in a quick review, if you have not seen the first 3 episodes or installments, we kind of looked at what inflammation is, how it's related to diet, what chronic low-grade inflammation is as it results to health status or as it relates to health status. And then I mentioned I really wanted to go over some of the mechanisms of what it really means, which led us to pretty much just the immune system and an autoimmune response to some of the things that you see with diet and just lifestyle. And I think, if anything else, these 4 pieces together that we're going to conclude today give us kind of a bullseye approach. And I hope by the end, what you'll see is the center of that bullseye is just your overall health status. Just like we chatted about fat collectively, adipose tissue being an organ that has a lot of endocrine and immune system functionality to it. And so just the state of being overweight creates low-grade inflammation and higher risks in all kinds of disease, cardiovascular, cancer, et cetera. And then the act of eating certain ways, high sugar, high fat, the combination, saturated fat, how that increases that inflammatory process. So kind of on down the line, we've painted a picture that you're going to see in some of the summary remarks make it that the good old common sense about just being healthy and eating well is the centerpiece. But then when you start getting into those layered orbits, there are some things that are specific enough that I think are helpful to at least know why you're doing things. Uh, one of the greatest things I think we've uncovered in the last couple of years doing these research reviews is when it comes to goal attainment, just motivation, things like that, how tied they are to very, very deep intrinsic values. And you can't have that great of a value or a core principle that you live by if you haven't intellectualized it first. Something has convinced you that that's going to be something to live by. And so that's why these things, to me, are important to at least go through. So this study, or meta-analysis, as you probably already read, the effect of dietary sugar on biomarkers of subclinical inflammation, a systematic review and meta-analysis of intervention studies. I got pretty deep into this, and then I was a little bit unhappy that I feel like the title misled, because it doesn't really go into the specificity of just dietary sugar, the effect on subclinical inflammation. It really almost compares more types of sugar, which has some value, but you'll see at the end I did include a few other studies that we could kind of round out at least what I wanted to investigate today. And I think there's still greater information out there I can point you to. But a couple things to point out. First of all, what was good about this, I guess I've got it in the methods slide. I'll go over there so I don't have to just repeat myself. Before I do that, though, here's what I want you to think of in this broad scope. And I backtracked and filled in a couple slides here when I decided that this particular meta-analysis wasn't going to give me everything I wanted. Just some of these titles here: the effective dietary sugar intake on biomarkers of subclinical inflammation. That's what we're looking at. High fat or high sugar diets as trigger inflammation in the microbiota, the gut-brain axis. So again, it is a thing that researchers are looking at: fat versus sugar, what does what. And then excessive intake of sugar in accomplice of inflammation. I'll cover that one just a little bit. So it's truly not in either or. It's a, as we like to say, kind of a chronology or a combined mechanism when you look at all the things that create ill health through the inflammatory processes. So this particular one that we're going to look at today, here I want to read through just a little bit of this abstract so you can see exactly what they wanted to look at. Well, I'm sorry, this is actually a different one. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is one that we're not looking at, but I wanted to show you some of the differentiation. So microbiota, intestine, and brain interact one another through the afferent fibers of the vagus nerve, which is a major linkage of this one. It has been established that long-term dietary habits of influence gut bacterial diversity and are capable of inducing change in the hypothalamic energy homeostasis. The biological effects are mediated by microglial activation, systemic inflammation, and vagal afferent nerve signaling, culminating in neuroinflammation. It has been emphasized the need for further approach regarding the influence of dietary factors as well as their direct impacts on outcomes of the gut dysbiosis. And then if you read down here, they start talking about hyperlipid diets, that kind of thing, sugar as well. And what I wanted you to see is how many different systems and parts of our health that different changes in our diet can affect. So one of my problems at the onset of this whole topic was inflammation is so big. What is it? How do you even define it? It's not like you can say, oh, I broke my ulna. I know how to fix that. There, I can see it on imaging. I can put a cast on it and it heals. And this is why it happened. This is how we treat it. Inflammation, chronic inflammation, is this massive thing that can impact different parts of our body in different ways. One of the things I'm going to point to at the end is how different types of dietary habits really do have differential impact on different parts of our health. So now we're at this study that we're going to look at for a while. I'll come back to these other ones. So now we're looking at just sugar alone. It has been postulated that dietary sugar consumption contributes to increased inflammatory processes in humans, and that this may be specific to fructose, which was a big thing for a long time, alone in sucrose or in high fructose corn syrup. Therefore, we conducted a meta-analysis and systemic literature review to evaluate the relevance of fructose, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, and glucose consumption for systemic levels of biomarkers of subclinical inflammation, and blah, blah, blah. That's how that last line is just how they got their information. Chronic low-grade inflammation is a key factor in the pathogenesis of cardiovascular disease and is associated with the risk of developing diabetes, dementia, and depression. Also, low-grade inflammation is related to a higher risk of all-cause mortality in old age. Therefore, identifying modifiable risk factors that could effectively lower chronic inflammation would contribute to the prevention of chronic disease. And then skipping to another paragraph. Therefore, the aim of the current meta-analysis and systemic review was to evaluate the evidence from published human interventional studies regarding the relevance of dietary fructose, again, alone or found in sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, and dietary glucose as a comparator for biomarkers of subclinical inflammation. So right off the bat, let me skip over here real quick. Let me get to these methods. Okay, I'm going to back up and get these other slides. The reason I wanted to show you these methods first is because when we start with such a global, large topic like sugar, you're going to see that to do any kind of a succinct literature review or meta-analysis, you have to really define what you're looking for. So they kept this quasi-current from 1990 to 2018. In their mind, they had to look at human intervention studies. So they just wanted to kind of bypass lab models and rats and things. They also didn't want it to be observational studies. They wanted direct intervention studies. So they're drawing blood, they're doing things mechanistically and testing. They looked at healthy overweight adults. A BMI of 19 isn't that overweight, but all the way up to 40, and even some adolescents. They had diet, and I'm going to mention this a little bit here in a minute. They looked at studies that had administered dietary glucose, fructose, or sucrose. They excluded studies that manipulated glycemic load. So they weren't saying, hey, let's add some fiber. Let's see what this does with protein. Let's see what this meal does alone. They weren't looking at glycemic load, glycemic index, glycemic response. They just wanted to see these specific ingredients, forms of sugar in diet. The studies had to be at least 2 weeks. The range was all the way up to, I think I put that in the wrong space. Except wrong place. So they wanted greater than 20 subjects per study, and that range should be down there, range of 20 to 355 subjects per study. They ended up with 13 studies only in all that time with those criteria that included just over 1,000 subjects. 6 of these studies included isocaloric control groups. And the reason I put that line in there at the bottom is they still had a hard time with being this tight on their criteria, finding good comparative studies. Because I want to back up to this 4th line here: glucose, fructose, or sucrose, and bump you back up to this slide over here that I left behind a couple minutes ago, where they wanted to look at the, I'm in this 4th line as well, relevance of fructose, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, and glucose consumption. So sucrose is table sugar. That's 50% glucose and fructose. And fructose alone is, of course, what you famously find in fruit, not only. I mean, it also has fruit or glucose and fiber and other forms of sugar in fruit. But high fructose corn syrup is then, of course, the bastard child of fructose, because it's something that's mass produced from items like corn and so forth, and that has given rise to the sugary beverage industry. And part of this study, what they wanted to look at is there've just been a lot of assumptions made through observational studies. And I have to go back and mention that I have seen a lot of changes in the industry since I was in school. My bachelor's degree started in the 80s, finished in the 90s, and that had gone from the era of high fat, was the enemy. That was the kind of the 80s, the Pritikin model, the Ornish model. So everything was just avoid fat. Then all of a sudden, here came the zone diets, the resurgence of Atkins, and then all of a sudden, sugar was the blame of everything. And part of that was because the rise of around 1978, when high fructose corn syrup was entering the scene, and all the way up into 98, you see that massive rise, and that was a big part of obesity gain. And I think if you commit the scientific method sin of correlation not equaling causation, you can see, okay, from 1960 to around that point, you see obesity markedly increase in all these problems, and everybody's looking at, gosh, what happened? What can we correlate this to? And that was one of the big changes. And so everybody all of a sudden was giving sugar and sugar additives the target on the back. And in retrospect, now, as you're going to see here, it just was way different than that. It was way more comprehensive. It was a lot of shifts into low activity. You had video games, cable TV, internet, two parents working 2 jobs, latchkey kids. There were so many things happening in culture. And processed food was never just about sugar alone, as we discussed in this series. It was always high palatable processed foods, which includes a lot of saturated fat and so forth. Nonetheless, sugar increase in diet did go up. You can see this rise. Right now, we're, of course, at the top, in the US kind of leads in some of those bad lifestyle things. So some organizations, some countries suggest that we should get no more than about 5% of free sugar in our diet. The World Health Organization says, 10% would be a good goal. We're up around 25%. But from that 1998 then forward, we started seeing an actual decrease. So now we as Americans are kind of on the downside. Part of that, I think, is the infatuation with keto type diets and so forth. And now plainly carbs are kind of the enemy in a lot of people's mind. But even as that was happening, as we've decreased our consumption of sugar, free sugar, added sugar, obesity has actually gone up, keeps going up faster and faster. So I don't think you can just blame it on one thing like that. That the trends absolutely supersede one change in culture. So the methods of this, now that we've talked a little bit about how they wanted to construct this meta-analysis. The evaluation was done quantitatively through meta-analysis and qualitatively through brief narrative review. Quality of meta-evidence was also addressed. We selected the acute phase protein, high sensitivity, C-reactive protein, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then all these other chemokines here. I just wanted to mention this because at the very end here, they discussed that a lot of these biomarkers are tracked differently in different studies. And so they wanted to start with what the big dog CRP was in most of these studies. And then through narrative, they kind of compare some studies that they pick out of those 13 studies, one to contrast to another, which I'll show you a little bit of. But in a large part, this meta-analysis was trying to, again, look at glucose, fructose, or sucrose as individual sugar additives to see if they could find which ones would have the greatest impact on ill health through inflammation, or if there was one clear enemy. If we could say that, yeah, these high fructose corn syrup, additives were the big thing, because through those observational studies, so many people have almost conspiratorially said, that's it. That's the evil of all of society. If we could just get rid of those, if we could just get kids to not drink soda and juice and all these foods with high fructose corn syrup, we would solve all the problems. So if we replace high fructose corn syrup with another sugar, would it make a difference? That's part of what we're going to kind of find out. So because a lot of these studies only compared two things and didn't look at this holistically, they had to break this out. And the analytical work was pretty robust. This was one of these meta-analyses that really had some good quantitative analysis and some great charts if you were interested in looking this up. But in summary, when they tested free fructose versus free glucose, C-reactive protein increased 4% by fructose and 23% by glucose in one study. And when they were compared directly, and that they picked that out first, not to say that this is the outlier, but most studies showed no significant difference at all. If you could say there was one that was actually a little worse, then it wasn't that fructose is the bad guy, and it gets painted as such, kind of rightly so, in that when you ingest fructose, the cells in your body, the mitochondria and your muscle tissue and so forth, can't use it directly as energy. So it has to travel through the bloodstream. The liver will start converting it mostly to fatty acids. And therefore, two things happen. One group who was pro-natural food, pro-fruit, and so forth, say, hey, that's what makes it a low glycemic index sugar. That's what makes fruit low glycemic in a large part. And so fructose isn't bad. Other people say, well, no, you can't even use it. Your body converts it right to fat. That's how you create fatty liver issues. And so it's awful. You should never consume fructose at all. Fructose, bad. Fruit, bad. High fructose corn syrup, super bad. And again, some of these comparisons were like, it doesn't seem to do that at all. So why does it have that reputation? Matter of fact, MCP1, another chemokine, which is like the cytokines in the immune response, increased by 38% by fructose and decreased with glucose. So again, it just showed that maybe sugar alone isn't even necessarily a bad thing. But comparing sucrose, so now table sugar, to fructose and to glucose, mishmashing all 13 of these studies where there was direct comparison and having to set them side by side and say, if this study showed this and this study showed that, then clearly this is true, A plus B equals C, that kind of thing. The main inference is that there just doesn't seem to be a difference. Like we've talked about in this particular series, total load, total amount of sugar, whether you're in a hypercaloric state or not, whether you were overfed or not, whether you were already overweight or obese or not, those tended to be the bigger issues, not which particular sugar source you were getting, or even we'll get to later, sugar versus fat. C-reactive protein increase found only in sucrose and fructose, increase in sucrose and fructose in one study. The whole purported fatty liver increase from fructose was always limited to hypercaloric intervention and supraphysiological fructose levels. So if somebody still hangs on to the belief that, oh man, fructose, bad stuff, you just have to avoid it, it's just bad because your liver can't process it, that is only if you're consuming massive amounts. If you sit down and eat 10 bananas in one sitting, then you may have too much sugar and too much fructose. If you have a hypercaloric diet in general and you're just consuming too many calories, especially at that one sitting, when your blood sugar levels are increasing, blood lipids, blood amino acids, now your body has this abundance of multifactorial nutrients. What does it do with fructose? Well, it doesn't need it. So then it does convert it to fatty acids. And then you've got, an issue with that. But again, hypercaloric supraphysiological levels only. Otherwise, you don't have to avoid it. Now, again, I'm not here to be a funnel piece, nor was this study to say, well, that means high fructose corn syrup is fine. They actually did look at high fructose corn syrup, and also it had to be hypercaloric high amounts, which can happen. If you're drinking a 44-ounce Dr. Pepper from the gas station, and you're eating a bag of Doritos, and you go through all of these things, then absolutely that's when high fructose corn syrup can become a little bit of a cytotoxic poison. And part of it is because of that conversion of fructose into liver fatty acids. One of the things that was interesting in this particular meta-analysis was they said they just could not get away from the fact that when you see some of these studies that contradict each other, where CRP didn't really increase here, but then MCP did increase, and blah blah blah, was there are pro table sugar industries, people who make those tiny little white packets, and then high fructose corn syrup industries. And these are lobbyist groups that have money. They fund some of these studies. They put some of these researchers on their board of directors, and they said there was clear bias. Whenever they found an outlier that just completely escaped the norm found by every other researcher, they could just look to who funded the study and who's on that particular, big sugar, big fructose payroll. And it was just obvious to them. And gosh, that pisses me off. I can't believe we still have to deal with that. So the conclusion, before we move on to a couple other studies that may pad a little information here for us, is that the overall findings as collectively analyzed by a meta-analysis do not support the hypothesis that dietary fructose alone, or in high fructose corn syrup, is more detrimental with respect to subclinical inflammation than dietary glucose or sucrose. And first of all, nobody just eats glucose. Like, table sugar is sucrose, which is 50% glucose and fructose. You just don't see these things as they were isolated, but it gives us at least something to look at least one little thing to hook some information on, and then we have to add some layers. However, the studies included in this review were heterogeneous, and some of the comparisons only had small numbers of studies providing limited evidence. That's why I said they had to kind of compare and equate some studies. Consequently, the grading of meta-evidence was low for all comparisons in order to draw more confidential conclusions about the pro-inflammatory effects of free fructose or fructose found in sucrose versus glucose or other non-fructose containing carbohydrates. Further human intervention studies with larger sample sizes, follow-up periods, et cetera, have to be done. So that's kind of one of the main points, is where we think we have great conclusive information on this, it really just doesn't exist. They looked at some of the best, tightest comparisons, and it just wasn't there. And whenever they could find something, as I mentioned, it was more due to it was always in a hypercaloric state using supraphysiological. That study that came out, I saw Lane Norton do a little blurb on it that showed, I think it was it sucralose? That I think it had Splenda sucralose. that would actually break down DNA, like get in there and start harming you epigenetically right away, just start tearing up your DNA. And he pointed out where the study itself, I forget the amount, so don't take my word for this, but it was, again, super physiological. You would have to consume like a 55-gallon drum of sucralose every day to get the effects. And even in the study themselves, they said at normal levels, there was just a complete null. There was just no effect. But they wanted to show if you did have massive, 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 massive amounts, then it does this. Maybe there's some value in a study like that, but it's not, necessarily what a human being is going to run into. So some of this stuff, again, points us in a direction, but it's not the whole answer. So this one was a little interesting. Excessive intake of sugar, an accomplice of inflammation. This meta-analysis was a little more basic in that it points to all of the mechanistic ways that sugar does create a pro-inflammatory, anti-health environment in your body. And it really even had some great graphics. It would be if I was a freshman nutrition type student, this is the kind of meta-analysis I would want to see, because it really showed exactly what's happening and how. All I wanted to show you from it was that the high glucose environment, just having too much sugar in your diet, is inextricably linked with the immune system, which plays an important role in immune signal and immune cell function. Previous studies have found that high levels of glucose may lead to impaired immune system function and pathological conditions, innate immune macrophages, dendritic cells, blah, 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 blah. That's the kind of stuff I learned in school, which is part of what, as a nutrition student, made you just say, yeah, sugar's bad, of course, and that's very, very general. And it's still the case when you have a high sugar meal. If you just did a test, I'll use the example I just did of somebody having a 44-ounce soft drink, and you just have that massive load, 200 grams of sugar that goes into your bloodstream, your blood sugar levels go up. You can see immediate impairment of your immune system. One particular study I think I noted in this presentation even looked at cognitive skills and how acutely, right off the bat, in that high sugar environment, your brain just doesn't work as well. And so this was never our attempt here to elucidate some of this inflammation topic, was never about which is bad, fat or sugar, or can we find one enemy to avoid? What kind of dogma can I hang my hat on? It's more to look at what's happening individually so that you can create those deeper values of why perhaps this food I'm going to avoid completely. Maybe this is going to be a sometimes food. Maybe I need to rethink my approach in my entire distribution of macronutrients. This is the kind of information response I want you guys to have. So excessive sugar, of course, bad, just like we found out last week that the high lipid levels, trans fats, saturated fats are maybe even worse, but in different ways. So here's just another, I don't know if I took something out of this, but another study I looked at, metabolism and health impacts of dietary sugar, from the Journal of Lipid and Atherosclerosis. Okay, I did. So consumption of excessive amounts of added sugar and their effect on human health has been a major concern in the last several decades. Epidemiological data suggests that the incidence of metabolic disorders such as obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes has increased due to chronic surplus consumption of these sugars. So that's kind of what we're fed. Again, there's that correlational cultural increase in sugar, and then all these things were on the rise. So that must be related. While many of these sugars have been isolated and studied for centuries, their health impacts and exact underlying mechanisms are still unclear. And 2 points, besides what I just said, that correlation can't equal causation, if you're a good science student, this line, many of these sugars have been isolated and studied for centuries, which is exactly the meta-analysis we just went through. And we don't eat them in isolation. We just don't. So that can give us a clue to the epidemiology. Is one really, really bad? Is one thing worse than another? Or again, is it the total load and other complementary factors? And so this kind of is a basic review of that. In this review, we discussed the pathophysiological role of 6 major simple sugars present in the human diet and the biochemical molecular pathways related to their metabolism by different organs and gut microbiota. So this was another meta-analysis, and also very, very interesting if you were to look at it. If you guys ever go through these and decide, hey, I'm going to go look up this particular study and this one that Joe mentioned, it was very educational. It showed 6 different types of sugar, not just fructose and glucose and et cetera, lactose, and in exactly the pathways they go through for digestion and absorption and their impact on different cells and tissues. And it's all fascinating. But again, what does that really mean? What does it do in a human body on a day-to-day basis in combination with other things? And that becomes, I think, the bigger picture for us. So here's the bottom line on all 4 of these. And then I know Dr. Souders is going to come in here and really bring some clarity. But sugar and saturated fat both cause inflammation, obesity, and substantial risk elevation. So both, not either or. They appear to be mechanistically impact different physiological structures and processes. And in particular, some of these studies show that sugar to the gut microbiome and maybe even brain function is worse than fat, probably because most of our brain structure is phospholipid. Fat relating to the greater obesity and cardiovascular system as part of the obesity epidemic. So that's where fat affects us a little bit differently. Both to immunity in different ways. Don actually addressed that a little bit last week. So sugar does one thing, fat does another. They're both bad. They're both really awful. They just attack different parts of our health in different ways. And then combined, sugar and saturated fat create the most disruption. And that's where I think, the behavioral norm is in our culture. You just don't see people becoming ill or obese because they're having too much sugar or too much fat. If you're going to have a highly palatable hypercaloric diet, you're getting both. You just are. So in a non-hypercaloric lifestyle, this is just one of the things that I think we can tease out, that if you just look at the norms, and especially Western culture, the foods available, Western diets has permeated the rest of the world at this point. But in a non-hypercaloric lifestyle, so let's say it's us, we're healthy. We try to be as lean as we can. We're all exercising. We've got a lot of the lifestyle habits that would make any researcher happy. A higher fat diet really does impose a greater risk than high sugar diets, because that's what we interact with the most. I don't think any of us just goes and eats too much fruit. I don't think any of us is going and getting 32-ounce or 44-ounce Mountain Dews from the gas station every day. Those people who are doing healthier things, for us, it's going to be, man, can I really, in my indulgences, stay a little bit leaner? Can I stay away from these processed meats and get into leaner ones? And I want to show you a real life example of that. I posted this yesterday. I don't know if anybody had a chance to watch this particular interview or know anything about Dr. Scharfenberg. It's just, first of all, this particular interview was very, very touching because he's just such a cute little old guy. He just giggles so much when he talks. He's so happy and positive, and he giggles like a little boy. Like, I was just laughing out loud the whole time watching this interview. But here he is. He's a physician, a medical doctor who also got an MPH from Harvard, and then went on to teach nutrition at a university for the rest of his career. And he was so incredibly sharp. Even at 100 years old, he was just citing these, oh, yeah, in 1974, we did this. And, oh, yeah, that was my colleague in 1998. He did this. And we presented this paper here. And this is what we found. And, oh, this is what everybody's got wrong right now. This is what we knew back then. They actually showed him doing a lecture in like the 1950s. He was already an old guy. He already looked like he was ready to retire in the 50s. That's how much life this guy has seen. But here's the thing. If you watch him religiously, he's a Seventh-day Adventist, which means he avoids animal products. He's a lacto-ovo vegetarian, always has been. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. He's active with just modest exercise and movement. Now that he's at this advanced age, he said meal timing is something that we really have to pay attention to. He said so he only eats 2 meals a day. And as a vegetarian, he has always had a high carbohydrate, and he's an N of one, obviously. Just his life alone as an anecdote doesn't mean what he's done is correct. But they've actually done studies, longitudinal studies, like one of them is called the Seventh-day Adventist study, because like why is this group so healthy? And part of their religion is to abide by those natural nutrition and health lifestyle dictums. But so when you look at a guy who's eating nothing but dried fruit, a lot of fructose, super high carb, and yet he's 100 years old and he's still walking around like he's 45. So again, I just think there's something to be said for looking at those case studies, because collectively those case studies do present some good review information. All right, guys. So now let's sort through some of this great information. I know we had incredible dialogue last week and all the way through with some of you medical professionals here. If you are available, Jen, I know just sugar, inflammation, all its relationship to pain and dysfunction is your wheelhouse. So we just love to see what we can do to wrap this up.
All right. Well, this was actually really great because it really does shine a light on the realities of the situation. Our bodies are built to manage glucose. And our bodies know how to dispose of it. If you have a healthy body and you give it glucose, our bodies know how to dispose of that. So that finding that glucose in and of itself didn't cause a lot of inflammation or issues does not particularly surprise me. But we don't take a lot of glucose because you really, the thing about sucrose is it's in a dry form. And glucose, you typically can't get it except in sort of a liquid syrupy form. So you'll find glucose, say, in sports drinks. But again, who's drinking sports drinks? Some people who don't need them. But again, we've talked about this before. If you're a 325-pound offensive lineman, even if you're arguably carrying a lot of extra body fat with that kind of activity level and energy expenditure, and you're drinking Gatorade, you're just going to process all that stuff immediately. It's not going to do anything. And we've talked about this sort of, ad nauseum as well in terms of fructose. Fructose, there's never, in my mind, been any good evidence linking fructose as a component of fruit eaten in its whole form. There's never been any really good evidence linking that to problems. Because we have all the phytochemicals and the fiber and everything else, and the time that it takes to digest it, the time that it takes to get it into the bloodstream, the positive aspects of whole fruit on gut bacterial health, the positive aspects of the various phytochemicals and antioxidants and things in fruit on general inflammation. Now that, again, that's not really a problem. I think where we've come into problems has been really with the advent of sucrose. So once sucrose, in terms of, regular table sugar, the 50-50 mix, was introduced hundreds of years ago, you started to see an increase in gout, for example. So that in some of the historical research, once the triangle trade and the slave economy was really cooking starting in, say, the 1600s, and sucrose became a very big part of people's diets suddenly where there was none, then suddenly we start to see a bit more increase in some of these metabolic diseases, and gout's, a good example of it. But again, when you think, and I know Don is going to feel this way too, when we think evolutionarily, so we didn't have sources of sucrose before, really. I mean, we really didn't. People who did harvest cane and get cane sugar and things, again, still that was a very intensive process. And until it became on a mass industrial scale, again, there really wasn't a huge impact, I think, on people's lifestyles. So people were, if they're eating saturated fats in their meat, well, that's arguably not super healthy, but you're not introducing an extra stress. So I think what has happened in modern society is exactly what these papers point out. We have a high predominance of sucrose, which delivers a load of fructose in a way where it's coupled with glucose. So you're getting actually a bigger load, right? So the liver has to process the glucose and the fructose at once, and it's not getting in slowly like it does when you're digesting an apple. So there's that. We're also not typically eating that in isolation. I mean, yes, if you've got, the 40-ounce, 44-ounce big gulp or something like that. Yeah. And again, you're going to see that load, just as you pointed out, because it's too much and it's too much of everything. But it's really the combination of our lifestyle factors in our food. So the industrial food complex, we have the high fructose corn syrup and the sucrose. Both of them are used rather extensively. Sucrose is put in everything to be a preservative. It extends shelf life. Your bread will advertise no high fructose corn syrup in it. But if you look on the ingredients, it has sucrose in it. So guess what's keeping it from staling on the shelf? It's the same thing. So we're having that with too much calories, too much saturated fat. And when you hit the liver with a big load of fat plus a big load of sugar in the form of either high fructose corn syrup or sucrose, the liver just can't process all that. Not only that, but we tend to eat a lot every day, either more than we need or more often than we need, or both. And finally, our modern food processing puts a whole lot of unknown types of ingredients, a whole lot of additives in there, which many of them are pro-inflammatory in studies that I've looked at. And a number of them can have negative effects on gut microbiota. And if your gut microbiota aren't working well, they're, first of all, going to contribute directly to an inflammatory state with the body. But second, they're also not going to help the body dispose of these nutrients any better. So really, we're looking at the whole modern lifestyle. And really, the easiest way to maintain a healthy diet is to not so much obsess about any one of these particular things, but as we've always been talking about, all of us here, is that, just try to eat a basic whole foods diet, foods that your great grandparents could recognize what they looked like when they saw them on the table. And if you avoid as much processed food as you can. And if you do that, you're probably not going to overload your liver or spike a lot of inflammation, perhaps even in a hypercaloric state.
So before I get to, because Kim, I think you were going to jump in and say something. You and Don both are, right there in queue. I know. When I started teaching nutrition in the 90s, it was very much directed toward what you just said there at the end, Jen, which is, here's your liver, part of the whole hepatic processing system, gastric neural loop, monitoring what's happening, chemoreceptors in the body, is what's happening with blood sugar, what's happening with blood lipids, blood amino acids, all the paired hormones are just on cue, ready to do something. Am I in a hyper or hypocaloric state? What's happening? And I started teaching more quantitatively than qualitatively. And even when I created my first Dr. Joe's Building Blocks of Nutrition, which Eric Helms later published almost identical and called it a pyramid, it was first foundationally energy balance, which is what any textbook would. You have to have the right amount of food. And that's what these things show. And it's very much like Dr. Scharfenberg. He can eat to one extreme direction, being, anti-animal, low fat, high vegetarian, whole food stuff, and be one of the healthiest guys who's ever lived. You could probably go quite a ways in the other direction as long as you're committed to that and you're lean and healthy and moving. And as you said, Jen, you're disposing of these nutrients, glucose disposal, and so forth. It reminds me of just watching my grandson eat. You watch a 2-year-old, that child's not going to eat what they're not hungry for. They just haven't learned those habits of rushing, or, oh, I may not get this again, so I better gobble it down. If he's hungry, he eats. If he's not, he doesn't. And sometimes it's, a whole egg and there's nothing but protein, and he doesn't want any carbs. And other times it's a carb snack. And so I just think if you go back to thinking, what does my body need right now? When's the last time I ate? What's my activity level going to be in the next couple hours? When do I get to eat again? How much carbohydrate can my body process right now? What does it need? How much fat, protein do I need right now? If I'm high in one, like I mentioned last week, if I'm going to sit down and eat an 8-ounce steak and I've got that much fat, well, maybe I probably should keep my carbs kind of light in that meal, because I'm going to have a lot of calories from that and I just don't need it. But anyway, Kim, were you going to jump in and say anything? I'm sorry, Amy.
Yes.
I was thinking of your last name for some reason. I was getting Kim instead of Killian.
Well, it shows me as Dr. Martin right now because I
Right,
jumped in
right.
this house. This is quiet. I agree so much with what Dr. Souders said. I mean, you really can't sum it up better than that. But when you look at the diet as a whole, I think is where people get lost. Everybody, it's so much our society and our quick fix mentality is we want the one thing. We're all looking for the fix, the one thing that's going to do this. Like you and Kevin were talking about when we first came on about the, COVID and like finally giving your immune system a challenge. Like, was it this one thing when COVID came out? Like, oh, it's going to be this, or if this isolated nutrient is what's going to be the key. And when you look at studies on nutrition, you can't isolate a nutrient and get the same result as you do with a whole food. Quercetin is a great example. So if you look at isolated quercetin, the effects are not as powerful as if you look at the effects of eating an apple or eating those apple skins, because there's so much more at play. And I think the body is so much that way. So you have to look at the overall toxic load of a person. We have so much exposure, not only to toxic substances in the pollution, also with blue light and EMFs and everything else that's coming at our cells. So looking at, just one isolated molecule of sugar, is that really the problem? Well, it could be. Maybe your diet is perfect otherwise, and that is the one problem. But if it isn't, how can you fix everything else to make sure that when you do have these insults, when you eat that fatty steak or when you have a bag of Skittles, randomly, that it doesn't completely derail your whole body and send you into this cycle of inflammation that you can't get yourself back out of. And that's really, I think, the key for most people is finding that balance more so than trying to like isolate just one thing that they want to blame everything else on.
Well said. I was speaking on the phone with a client explaining, because I came back down to just everything I could synthesize into it has to be a value, it has to be a value. I went through the Harvard functional MRI study, and he brought up the perfect question. Well, how do I create that value? How do I get there? Because he's lost and gained weight, lost and gained weight, lost and gained weight. And I said, man, it's such a good question. And I can't just pedantically say, if you want it bad enough, you'll do it. Like, I want to give you a better answer than that. But I said it has to come over time, where one habit leads to another, to another, to another. But the long value is there. I want to be healthy. I want to live a long, energetic life. And I said, for example, I'm somebody who has certain ranges. I mean, all of the quote bad foods taste just as good to me as something else, but you just intellectually learn enough and experientially learn that I definitely don't like being overweight, obese, inactive, sick, etc. I want the other. So you learn to make those challenges or meet those challenges with good decisions. So if I'm hungry at night and I really feel like I need a snack before bed, am I going to go get the Doritos? Am I going to get the ice cream? No, I'm going to probably go get a little handful of granola or something like that and say, okay, that was the best choice. I'm just making one good choice at a time. And then in aggregate, to what Amy and Jen both said, you end up looking at your life in retrospect and saying, yeah, I actually eat probably 80-90% really, really healthy foods. And when I indulge, it's still with some kind of restraint. And I know that I'm indulging. That's an occasional thing to do. Jen, were you going to jump back in? I saw you unmuted there.
Yeah, I just I wanted to say a couple other things too. is that, one of the things we have going for us, or I should say going against us, is our modern lifestyles are so pro-inflammatory in other ways. So another reason that we need to be attentive to the effects of even small dietary changes, making changes in systemic inflammation, is because of the fact that there are many factors in our lifestyle now, the way modern society is, that and you and I have talked, you and I and David Hanscom are all, in this trio discussion about these incredible factors that are within our minds actually right now. But how the current lifestyle that we have, and just the fact that humans have language and think obsessively, and we're now bombarded with even more information than we ever used to be. We have these thoughts that come into our heads a lot more often, and they actually can produce real significant pro-inflammatory, systemic, stimulatory effects on us. And so given that that's already our state, I think this is one of the factors that maybe hasn't been accounted for, along with all the other changes in modernity, such as, sedentary lifestyles, the, systemic oppression through racism or economic disadvantage, lack of safe neighborhoods for children to exercise, video games, there's so much going on. And on top of it all, now we pushed the button of this incredible mental overload where mental factors can really increase inflammation in the body all by themselves. So we're being kind of assaulted on all sides. And it becomes more important to manage what you can manage that's within your control. And so diet is just one part of that. But I think for people, when you're looking at these studies, I don't know of any one of them that has controlled for some of those factors, and how they relate to diet. It would be very interesting to see how that might play out if someone ever did a study, because we talk about food deserts, and we also talk about sort of food bonanzas too. And there's just a lot going on behind those in terms of what is really going on at a societal level. It's very complex right now.
I bet there are. I'm going to look, Jen, but I think they'd be kind of on the psych side or social science research. If they're
And again, that's one of the problems, is that as we've been saying in my group for a while, is that these things like anxiety and stuff, it's not actually it's not a mental health problem so much as it is a neurological and neuroinflammatory problem. It's a biochemical problem. It's a physiological problem.
Which is why I quoted Dr. Hanscom this week in my coach's
Yeah,
clinic.
I saw
that it's biology first. But it's funny when you say it's biology and biochemical and neurochemical, but it is the psychological interpretation of that stress that then immediately makes it physiological. And so it's almost like I almost didn't say that right in my post. But again, I think, yeah, to your point, like social science and psych research, they're probably not going to have access to doing all the biochem research models that an epidemiology type researcher would do. But I'm going to look into that, because that is really, really interesting. I just had my second Soma yoga session last night, and my wife, myself, and a couple clients doing this. Like, we are totally hooked, simply because of what you're saying there, Jen. All of the attentional and other lifestyle issues that create that physiological inflammation, for you to start picking apart your life and creating boundaries to say, okay, I'm literally going to leave my phone in the living room when I go to bed. I'm not taking it to bed. And I'm not going to look at my phone the first thing I wake up. And I'm going to make sure I sit down and have a slow, enjoyable meal without working at my keyboard while I eat. All of these things that I am going to get enough sleep, that you can start doing I think you really do see even increases in other health choices, because not only does success beget success in your habits, you just start to tamp down all of that cortisol and impulsive fight or flight threat response reactions, because a lot of those are food related. You get
Yeah.
those massive glucose and lipid dumps because of adrenaline. That creates that biochemical instability, and then you start fueling your body with shitty sources, because that's just what you want for that immediate gratification, that immediate neural change.
Yeah. I mean, if a person just simply attended to their sleep and got consistent, good, restorative sleep every single night and changed nothing, stayed sedentary, ate crap, never exercised, they would still probably lose weight because of all the hormonal signaling that's influenced by just that change. It's amazing how interrelated it is. And I see Kevin nodding his head, and I'm sure he's seen a lot of this in his practice as well.
There are conclusive studies on that. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's
dogmatic percentage.
it's crazy. We don't have, we don't have to move every single slider all at once. So with clients, as coaches, what we do is we get to know them, and we ask them, well, where do you feel you would like to move first? What is troubling you the most? Or, where do you think you could be most effective in putting your action? And then let's just focus on that for a month and see where that goes. I mean, it can start so small, but once people also realize that they can gain control of that one thing, you know how that goes. We've all seen this.
Well, I'm going to answer Amanda's question real quick before Don
Yeah.
wraps us up. So, Amanda, resoundingly yes and no. Sugar, which does affect the gut microbiota, makes all kinds of changes, not just to hunger signaling and hunger cues, but they've even done studies where they can replace that microbiota, take some of that bacteria from one person's GI system, implant it in another, and that person starts having those same symptoms. And so it is at that biochemical level. But the very, very, very most recent research on pre and probiotics are that when you start taking them, you always end up worse.
Yeah.
And so I would just avoid not, because you overpopulate one or two or three strains out of hundreds of bacterium, and you just end up with far, far worse GI system issues. So as Jen said, get them from Whole Foods, eat yogurt, avoiding just the bad stuff, including chemicals. Your gut microbiome will replenish itself. It's very, autolytically self-healing in that regard.
Good Lord, just give it some fiber.
Right. Right.
That's one super easy thing that in the modern diet is so low.
And avoid the sugar that feeds it and then creates all of that, anaerobic bacteria garbage. Don, were you going to say something brilliant to wrap us up?
Really? It's easy on the stress there now. Great. I agree with Jennifer a lot with what she's been saying. Before I talk about a couple of points, I think it'd be a great conversation on brain mind and all that it means, and because it's my area, but mentation and biology, and how often that is so screwed up, even at expert levels, and all those things that trickle out of that. Well, everything that trickles out. I think that'll be a great research piece for you to bring to the table. Just my thought. So getting back to inflammation and these past 3 times, some of my observations are this. We talk about macros in the protein, carb, and fat, and really what we've been talking about is carb and fat. And one of the clear distinctions for me has been in the reciprocal relationship seems to be one of the keys. The aspect is you're going to eat higher carbs, you gotta lower the fats, and if you're going to eat high fats, you better lower the carbs. And that the general population, fat diets, both are high. But there's a formulation, I think, in this also in the aspect of 3 macros equals caloric load. And I think it's really important to put that other variable in there, and you have, and you've been explicit with it. So in essence, I'm just recounting that the volumetric of the calorie load for the individual is so vitally important. One of the things that we know for sure for anti-aging is very low calorie diet. Doesn't matter what you eat, very low calorie diets for age increase. And so, sorry, I'm just driving here. I think it's important if we look at the reciprocal relationship in carbs and fats and protein amounts to the total calories per day for the individual metabolism, wherever that may be on the spectrum, and fractally, what are the meal loads to that. So you have the total in the day, and what does that meal look like? Now, that being said, like I've said in the past, I'm a big evolutionist. Looking at evolutionary requirements, and really more importantly, evolutionary adaptation to the mammalian and the human and proto-human species, and really what we've survived and thrived and adapted into. And that, are we in evolutionary alignment, or are we in evolutionary malalignment? And for the vast, because we're in civilization, we're often in evolutionary malalignment for the reasons you put forward, and Jennifer and you just talked about on the multiplicity of impacts that occur to the DNA. Well, actually, that occur to the cellular state, membranes, which epigenetically code to the DNA for expression, and quite often there is no expression because it's not the damn code, and the DNA is trying to do the best it can. So I think that taking out the athlete per caloric needs, like Jennifer said, that a 350-pound linebacker drinking Gatorade, yeah, they're gonna utilize that in the moment. And that doesn't matter. For the average individual, it comes down to that what is the needs per day, that if you're out of alignment on that reciprocal relationship with fat and carbs, if you're over calorically taking food in, your body is going to switch to that storage form, and the storage aberrancy that most people is occurring. So I think it's really important in that way. And then looking at exercise, I've always, I don't know, for 20 years I've asked the question to experts, also patients and clients, what is exercise? And I get the answer back from those that know, and it's really a research-based thing. It's all what the research shows what exercise is. And I say no to that. To me, exercise is a distillation of 10 or 12 hours of evolutionary movement distilled into an hour per day, 45 minutes, an hour and a half. And that begs the question, okay, what does that genome require in totality of movement, hunting, gathering, primal squatting before chairs, all that sort of stuff, all the things that drive genetic expression from a motoric and sensorium way, right? And so what's the exercise component impact on genes as well as caloric demand, which gives you that excess increase in caloric volume that you would calculate in as a coach or anyone, So, and that it's this imbalance that causes the multifactorial inflammatory or hyperinflamed state, which, as Jennifer's past pointed out, the research paper that she shared with me graciously, is all about, again, cellular membrane injury, and in the chronic states we're seeing, we see chronic inflammation. We can almost definitely look back to this formula and see why the chronic hyperinflammatory state exists And then if we want, we can look into the pathways, if we can dial it down and see if we choose, which inflammatory pathways are moving, or truth, we don't even have to, because again, getting back to the potential causation aspects, if we change those things, then the inflammatory pathways should all come back into alignment. And that's all I have to say.
Well, I'm glad, dude. You definitely get the last word there, and I'm glad you brought back to the Gatorade lineman metaphor, because if we can find something causal and we can put things in foundational order, we know, and even Dr. Scharfenberg mentioned this, that of all the things he would like people to know about nutrition as a nutrition professor, as somebody with a master's in public health and a physician, is you can have the leanest, healthiest looking, thinnest person in the world, and they are not as metabolically healthy as an overweight exercising person. And so all of that movement that leads to heightened glucose and lipid disposal is the ball game. And I love your point that to try to replace 10 to 12 hours of movement with a quick 30-minute workout once a day, it's a good start, but it's still not everything. And so because culture is changing so much, I'm glad non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, daily activity, counting steps, things like that has become part of the culture now. I mean, it's just huge. Our entire business model, we went from 20 years ago licensing to create just nutrition coaches to now my central model is the Diet Doc Fit Lab and Performance Center. It's to have coaches who have the ability to do training and exercise programming and on-site intervention, as well as just nutrition. I won't get into all that, but movement is definitely the big underlying part of that. So yeah, some good ideas for some future things on the mental aspects, some of the cultural aspects of this. So we may not call it an extension of the inflammation series. We may or may not, but something to think about. You guys, always, thank you so much for your contributions and your thoughts, and have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Joe.
Appreciate it, guys.
Enjoy.